Buddy, it is today, June 20th. It's again Monday morning, 10 o'clock, and welcome to the Monday morning chat about leadership. Today, I'm joined by Anne Richardson, who I had the pleasure of meeting some time ago. Although we have her audio, which is, of course, the most important part, the visual at this point in time is missing. Again, it's the value of our conversation that we will be having over the next 20 somewhat minutes about the changes that have taken place in healthcare, especially through COVID. And has been a long time administrator on multiple different levels in the healthcare industry, and has had an really interesting viewpoint on what we need to do in order to really go through a transformation that levels not only higher performance, which we all are very interested in, but to take into account those people who are going to be delivering the high performance to the system, and ultimately speaking, we want to positively impact our patients by providing quality and safety, growth and transformation. So, Anne, if you would not mind, why don't you introduce yourself to the team that is either watching or listening now or in the future, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
So good morning. Thanks for inviting me. And maybe my camera will pop in any minute. So I apologize for the lack of connectivity. I'm not sure what's going on. So I have a 25 plus year career as a healthcare operations leader. Started early in my education in nursing school and then segued into a healthcare administration undergraduate program because I really wanted to make a difference in the lives of patients. And I've been a fierce patient advocate since I was a child. Grew up in a nurse with a sibling significantly older than me who was a nurse. And I thought that was the pathway back then to leadership. And 2 years into a program in a BSN, I switched to administration because I realized that while I love working close to the clinical setting and working with care teams, that I didn't want to be a clinical nurse. And then I went on working full-time in administrative roles to get my MBA. And I've always been, again, a firm believer, and I just fine tune what I say today, is that to be a fierce patient advocate, and when I say advocate, I mean for access, but also safety, quality, not just checking a box, meeting a KPI, getting the numbers, but are we satisfying the patient, and are we doing it in the most respectful, dignified way with safety at the forefront of our minds with good quality outcomes. You need to do the same for the care team. I say care team because that's everybody, the physician, the advanced practice clinicians, nurses, respiratory techs, and so forth. So early in my career, one of my first leadership roles was working in a level 1 trauma center, academic medical center, leading a anesthesiology department. And I was young and new and felt nervous, like, oh my gosh, what am I doing in this position? Having said that, I was very inquisitive and I'm a very visual learner, and I learn every day with every conversation I have and everything that I see. I was met with high demands from a very large department who felt like they hadn't had somebody like me to pay attention to them in quite some time. New chairman I came in with and a new team. So the only way that I could really listen, develop a relationship with them, and earn that respectful engagement was to go to the operating room, because my office was in the medical school and I couldn't expect people who leave the operating room to come to me. And it was just something that felt comfortable. It wasn't something I learned. These are things you don't learn in an MBA program. You just use your logic. And once I started that and saw how quickly I was able to partner and earn the respect and trust from the clinicians, even those that I didn't direct. In that particular case, surgeons, nurses, and so forth. I learned so much, so much. And at times, early in that position, I would wear scrubs and go into the operating room, take myself off my schedule. Usually had a reason for being there initially. For example, assessing capital equipment, looking at workflows, understanding labor force distribution, those things. But then over time, I realized that, and I tell many stories about this that I love, is I was often that comfort measure person who could hold the hand of a child, being anesthetized, so many things. So it looked like, there were times a few people would say, how do you get your job done? I'd say, this is my job, because I could go to my desk and respond to any variance report or, a question that would come through email from finance or the executive leadership that I could speak to, because I felt like I was so embedded in the clinical flows of medicine that I had my finger on the pulse. Made it easier for me.
Yeah. It is really an interesting way of looking at that. Is that we talk about going onto the Gamba to see where the work is done, not from a standpoint of punitive, but from a standpoint of learning. And I think you emphasize both in your teachings and communications that we have had about the importance of being with the team and listening to the team to understand, and to really develop those key relationships and partnerships to develop a culture that is conducive to growth, but also really keep in mind the well-being of the persons that are doing the work itself. Sadly, in my many, focus area that I concentrate on mainly as the emerging leader, I still hear too many people working in toxic environments, or managers or leaders who just push, 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 and really don't care all that much about the people who are pushing. Can you give me some perspective on how you over time have learned to, and maybe even experience, a toxic environment or a bad boss, and how you convert that, or how you work with people to try to understand the value of being with the people on the front line, and really taking into account the full spectrum, right? The mental, spiritual, physical, relationship wellness of somebody in order to get the best possible performance out of them.
So I've worked in environments that were toxic, and where there were, the occasional bullies, so to speak. But sadly, even if the top, executive leader, let's say the CEO, maybe he or she wasn't necessarily toxic or a bully, but quietly you would hear behind closed doors, oh, but that person who is, they're getting the job done. And I would quietly say, well, define the job. And so I had this conversation with someone recently, and it was about a toxic CEO. And they said, oh, we agree with you, but he has such a great strategy and vision. I said, oh, I couldn't agree more. But when you're in the business of healthcare, and in this particular case, a health system of hospitals, where you're looking to establish, locations to bring care closer to the home,
Hmm.
whether it be an ambulatory surgery center, affiliate, clinics and whatnot, satellite clinics, you need physicians and nurses and others to do that, right?
Yeah.
So you could have the greatest strategy and vision, but if you have toxicity in your culture and people don't feel psychologically safe, guess what? High turnover, they leave, or they don't perform at their best. So your vision and strategy execution is only as good as the people. So for myself, I was always, and not patting myself on the back, but always was somebody that people would see that I had very high authentic engagement with my team, because I feel like, again, this isn't something you learn in undergraduate or graduate school. It's just being human, being kind, and loving what you do. I'm passionate about what I do. And I realize that what I do is supporting and respecting the team to do what they do, because we're talking clinical. I can help with the workflows, and I could be that outside pair of eyes, even though I'm working, in an area that I lead, not as a consultant, but as a permanent employee. You see things every day, but it's working in that whole pull with soft eyes versus telling people what to do, and leading by example, and just the exchanging the pleasantries and listening to people. So one of the things that I talk a lot about lately that I know is a problem, because it's happened to me too, so many of us have been silenced. And when it's no different than any relationship. You could liken this to a marriage or a family. The old saying is, when you stop, talking and fighting for improvement, you should be worried. And
Yeah.
I hear, so LinkedIn tends to be my active network. That's fairly new for me in writing on LinkedIn in the last, say, 8 or 9 months. The number of people that engage with me is high on any given day, but even higher behind the scenes that you wouldn't know. And that's because of people, namely physicians and nurses, who are afraid to engage publicly because of the psychologically unsafe environment. And the repeating theme I get from those, I'll often say, why me? And they say, because you hear us, you see us, you get it. And we wish we could have someone like you. Some people use the term hang out. I tend not to use that, but I get what they mean. And what they mean is the bridge and the gap between administration and the workforce is huge, bigger now than ever. And my fear is that the longer this persists in some organizations, because some organizations do a fantastic job with engagement. In fact, I know of some where their engagement scores with physicians have gone up during COVID. They were great before and they're even better. But I feel, and I know with some experience, that the longer the time goes on where we had that fight of us versus them, the harder it is. Because I've worked with physicians who say, oh, the leadership, executive leadership, they're afraid of us. They're afraid to come by. And the surgeons are actually right, because leadership gets to the point where, sometimes there's a level of hubris or ineptitude. And sometimes it's just a level of fear and paralysis, because so many of them have so much on their plate that they know if they go and they haven't been around for a long time, it's not going to be a warm reception.
Yeah, but we have to break through that, right? And that's really the key question, is that you can continue, like you say, you can have a great vision, but if you don't have the people and the partnership, you won't be able to drive that vision. I think the stressors that we have seen over the last 2 years with COVID, where we put an enormous amount of pressure on people without really any true relief valves. And again, rightfully said on your part, there are many organizations that got this right. Hi, how are you? Um, that got this right? They have done it well, but some, and I would say even the vast majority, have not quite gotten that right. Interesting. There was a statistics from 2021, a large survey that said that 87% of executive leaders know and understand the value of leadership development, and really taking, doing all those things that we talk about, loving the way you should lead, right? Leading with great focus, creating a safe psychological, physical environment, learning to work with great focus on a sustained basis. But sadly, only 5% actually followed through on a meaningful way. And that is really the big gap. And I've also seen that as pressure is starting to go up around budgets, right? Especially now that funding is trying to dry up related to COVID, and they're still recovering from their procedural activities. So what do you advise the people that you talk to, especially behind the scenes, to take meaningful action to try to prevent burnout and to become part of the conversation? Because that's really where we need to work, right? Is behind the scenes, get them to participate in conversation. Because otherwise, there needs to be a breakthrough. And I don't think it's executive leadership doing the breaking through per se.
Well, so here's this. I have worked for decades on the inside. I refer to it as directing large hospital-based departments, but I've also done directing multi-specialty practices, primary care, surgical services, OB, so forth. Worked many years in academic medical centers, but I also have led in community-based not-for-profits. Spent very little time in the for-profit arena, but I have some experience with that as well. And then I've done consulting in between, and we talk about the power of the network, but sometimes it's literally through your network, even outside of LinkedIn, that says, hey, this has come up, can you help us out? So I've spent as long as 6 months in hospitals, being boots on the ground 5 days a week, sometimes fulfilling an interim leadership role or doing some transformational change management work. But when I look at what we've gone through with COVID, we can't blame where we're at today with COVID, but you have to respect what COVID has, the impact to hospitals. And I would say this is that, and again, there's a lot of money being spent on consultants. And I'm the type of person, and maybe I'm wrong, and I've actually been criticized for this. It's like, we have a fiduciary responsibility when we go into a hospital system, let's say, to work with the team, listen to them and get it right, not check boxes, right? Hopefully make it meaningful for them and sustainable so that when we leave, they own it. And this doesn't make me popular among consultants, but consultants love scope creep. They go into a hospital and they're like, oh, great. Well, and in fairness to the executive leadership that signs the contract and engages them, sometimes for years, they're so paralyzed. They have so much on their plate, more now than ever. The external pressures with, what's going on with reimbursement, add COVID to it, add the three big expenses right now that are hitting hospital systems are the contract labor, increase in supply chain, also the increases of retention bonuses. sign-on bonuses, keeping, doing salary adjustments, all that is resulting in unfavorable bottom lines. And so they're
Yep.
getting pressure from, if it's for profit, from shareholders, but also the community at large and the board. I feel that we can't be consultants who go in and, I mean, yes, you need subject matter experts, no doubt, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I'm pausing myself to say, someone who didn't want to go back on the inside, we need those people on the inside, and why not? I've said this before. I had a organization last year when I was doing some consulting 5 days a week. One of the executives said to me, I'm a little concerned. And I said, why? And she said, because they're codependency. You get it. People like you. And I looked at her, I said, well, that's good. I then I'm effective. She says, no, but when you leave, what do we do? I said, recruit somebody like me. And if the characteristics that you see that helped me engage with these physicians and nurses and the team immediately, that allowed them to let down their guard and to listen, and we worked together and we made some improvement. There are people out there just like me. But so it's twofold. It's recruiting those people, but it's also treating them in such a way that they want to stay.
Yep.
So I feel, I mean, I have a lot of hope, but I do think, and the other thing I'll say this is that unless it's really egregious with the executive leader or CEO that somebody needs to do something at the board level, there's a lot of good people out there in leadership right now, and they're not shining. And to some extent, it's to no fault of their own. It's the environment that we're in. And I don't care how long and successful a CEO has been in place. They're people too.
Yeah.
And they've got constraints. So I think if we could just not look in the rearview mirror, except respect the past, to learn to not repeat mistakes, right? And truly partner. And not have an ego in it, and put the patient at the center. But honestly, we can't have a patient-centric model unless we're care team-centric. And
Yeah, absolutely.
that's
Yeah, go ahead.
but that's the key. And I'm a fierce. Why my network is so strong and so vocal, but often behind the scenes, is physicians, number one, and among the physicians, it's often surgeons. People would say that's interesting, surgeons, because of the revenue they generate and so forth. But again, they're human beings too. They don't want to be seen as the ATM cash cow. They want to have a name. No, I mean, really, at the end of the day,
agree.
I've said to CEOs, come on, this person's a mother, they're a sister, they're a daughter, they're a father, they're human beings. And right now, the level of anger and burnout is extremely high, because even in the best systems, when I say best in terms of revenue and some of the largest, it's still not enough, and they're pushing them and pushing them. So when I see and hear just in recent days of physicians and surgeons who are 40 years old who are leaving clinical medicine, that worries me. That worries me greatly, because we have an aging population, and it's not being dramatic to say who's going to be there for them, who's going to be there for us.
Yeah, and there's a severe shortage of both doctors and nurses on the horizon. If we think it's bad today, in 10 years from now, we don't really make real changes. Yeah, I too think that, executive leadership, they are people too. I think that too many of them are leading with plates too full and too shy, or not wise enough to ask for help. They too need to remember that their role is to lead and not to do. I think too many of them are doing, and therefore also leading at the well below their privilege. It is it's the stigma. I can do it all. That's why that's how I get to the top. We need to do away with that, right? It's really about how can we bring people in, how can we bring in temporary or full time people to help support the backbone, right? How can we make sure that the organization is wellness is high? And that's interesting. That's a new measure that we're starting to see a little bit more now. That we can start talking about mental wellness and overall wellness, not just about engagement. Although engagement is an indicator of the overall wellness of the programs. I do believe that, listen, it's the team that needs to learn to work together in partnership, and it's not doctors against nurses or against administrators. If you want to drive safety, quality, and all the other key indicators, you need to work as one. And that's where we need to start making a difference. And I really think that it's not. So my view of the consultant is this, right? It's like drive-by shootings. They come in, they do the deep analysis, they suddenly bring best practice and deep knowledge, but it's a drive-by shooting. They come, they scope it, they tell you what's wrong, and then they leave. What we really need is people to help build a sustainable habits and behaviors through development over a period of time that it allows the people to do the things and lead, manage process and lead people that really can help elevate the performance of the company, rather than using a crutch for a short period of time and then walking away, not knowing what will happen after that. I think that's where the real change needs to take place. As a follow-up question to that, so interesting. Now we talked a little bit about being an innovator and being disruptive. What does disruptive to you mean in healthcare, and what is the what impact could that have on how we change the paradigm going forward?
So, I mean, long before we really used that phrase, or another buzzword, I guess, is disruptive, is I've always believed in the power of respectful dissent. Knowing how to approach something, it's all in how we say it or how we ask. I'm also a firm believer. I had this conversation with someone the other day, and it was a physician. I said, when you're talking to a CEO, you don't ever want to ask in such a way that makes them feel like they failed or they get backed into a corner, because oftentimes, it's to no fault of their own. But even
Yeah.
if you perceive that it's their fault, you're not going to get a yes out of them if you're asking for something, if you make it a fight. So I feel that, the power of respectful dissent. I also feel that all of us every day, I mean, do our homework, do our research, and do the best that we can to understand, the circumstances and understand the people. But I also know from experience that consistency matters. So when I talked about early in my career being, it was before I even really knew what the Gemba was. I did go on to get lean training. And the reason why was because I saw things through the eyes of process and flows of medicine. I figured, okay, I'll formalize it and get certified. But it's being consistent. So to the extent that if I missed a day or a morning of what I would call rounding, even before that was, a buzzword, people would call me, page me in the old days, or text me to say, hey, where were you? You okay? Yes, I had a meeting. Okay, well, we look forward to seeing you. So I was known to be, and I still do this today, that it's meaningful rounding, meaning that you don't show up with a clipboard, no stopwatch. You just embed yourself, and if you have an opportunity to have your lunch, you go sit in the OR lounge, and you're sitting with surgeons, anesthesiologists, nurses, techs, whatever. They get to know you. I did a lot of work on inpatients as well. So even though those people did not report to me per se, I'm still connected with them to this day, 20 years later. It's developing a meaningful relationship where, at times you're in scrubs and sneakers and you're working alongside with them. You blend in. Even at times when I wasn't in clinical garb, I would know where that purple top was, and I could wipe down a stretcher and clean it in a PACU because they needed an extra pair of hands. It's being so close to the clinical team that you don't cross the line, because I'm not a clinician, but you can certainly provide that support, and not for any other reason other than you just know when they need it, and at the same time you're learning of opportunities of how we can do it better. So if I had to leave a clinical setting, and why I started this is I could be that fierce advocate for the patient, because I would see what people did in their jobs, and I could advocate for nursing, physicians, whatever the case may be. And I was also known for, if I did my homework and it was a safety quality issue, and I would leave no holes in a proposal, I wouldn't accept no for an answer. And I very rarely got a no, because even the most difficult of people above me would say, you know what? No one's ever presented it this way. Okay. And I even had an executive once, I love it. He said to me, can we negotiate this so that we can implement this today, 6 months, 50% today? And I walked away and said, wow, we went from a no to, okay, put it away, to, okay, we're going to approve it 100%, but we need to phase it in. Are you okay with that? And I said, this isn't about me. This is about patient safety. So of course I'm
Yeah.
okay with that. To
Yeah.
me, that's a success.
Yeah.
But consistency is so important. So important.
It's so funny. I mean, what some people would say is not even disruptive, but a new way of thinking really should be the normal, right? So one of the obstacles that are in the way is that time, right? The administrator, you going out and doing all those things that are extremely important, going to Gamba, spend time with people, build meaningful relationships, but there's still a job to be done over top of that, and that's where I feel that many of the emerging leaders have now the opportunity to really understand the value of what you just described and learning how to be more time, be better with time management of what they do versus what they delegate versus how they look for improvements and looking for opportunities. Give us a little insight on how you managed your day without making it an 18-hour day, 7 days a week. So do it is important, go to where the work takes place, but still be highly effective at your job as well as maintaining a home life.
Well, so that's always a challenge. And
Yeah.
you hit on something there. My hours often were very long. And as years went on, they got even longer. Early in my career, they weren't as bad, although I went to graduate school in the evening on top of my full-time job, which was full-time plus. And I went to graduate school back when it was still bricks and mortar and it wasn't online. And I physically had to show up for classes. And I think my program was 20 classes. So it was not an executive fast track. So it was a challenge. Today, honestly, and this is the complaint we get from everybody in leadership and physicians and staff, is the mandatory meetings that often don't add
Yeah.
value. And so there were times when I wouldn't show up to a mandatory regular meeting and was called out on it. And I would have to politely say, well, that's because I got called to a clinic and there was an access issue or there was a safety issue, something with a patient. And because I was the only non-clinical member of the team, I could be the one, to make that 911 call, whatever the case may be. And if I had to choose between being at a mandatory meeting that I might get in trouble for missing or being at the bedside or being with a clinical team, I'm going to choose the patient and the team every time.
Yeah.
Some people in leadership don't necessarily like that. I think that we need to, and the other thing I'll say this is that often it was a lonely being on an island alone because a lot of my colleagues weren't comfortable in the clinical setting and I made them uncomfortable. And there are a lot of people who love to go to meetings because they really don't.
Good place to hide.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that people that go to meetings are not effective, but I was never an armchair manager, and when I would go to an office, and I've actually had executives say to me, you need to decorate your office. It looks like you're not staying here. I said, look, this isn't a dorm room. I'm not here to decorate. I just need a computer, a printer, and a chair, and a quiet place to shut the door if I have a confidential conversation, but my office is not my home and the work is out there. And, but when I did go back to my office, to your point, it sometimes was late at night, but I could respond and do a variance report. I could do quarterly forecasts. I could do things down to the ridiculous level of detail because I knew it by being in it. Whereas a lot of my colleagues might have struggled a little bit more because they didn't necessarily have the time or take the time to kind of get to know what was going on. And even in areas that I didn't direct, it was still important for me to know them. So if you're working in surgical services, I used to take call and do rounds in the surgical ICU. I used to do rounds with the hospitalists. I mean, so I embedded myself in all those areas that, that followed that clinical pathway of where the patients would go. And I got to know people and I learned so much. So when I say I'm clinically savvy, it's because of the time I spent and continue to spend with clinicians and learn.
And this is the fastest 30 minutes of all the
Is it?
conversations. We're already to the end. I think we can do a 2.0 session sometime
Okay.
in September or beyond. Uh, Again, thank you for joining this morning. I'm
Thank
happy that we
you.
overcame the technical issues.
Yes.
It is something that I will cherish. People should be able to look back on it in the future. Next week, we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Catherine from Aushausen, who is an author who wrote a really interesting book about selfless leadership. That's something we can build up on our conversation. And thank you very much. They can all
Thank
find you
you.
on LinkedIn. Stay in touch. Say what is on your mind. Participate in civil discord or good conversations. because we need to have these conversations in order to continue to grow as people and as organizations, because that will drive quality and safety.
Yes.
And thank you very much for your
Thank
time this
you.
morning.
Thank you so
Take
much for
care.
the invite. Bye.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye-bye.